Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. The United States has been rocked by the alleged murder of George Floyd by a policeman in Minneapolis. Protests and riots are continuing in the US, and protests have spread around the world. Welcome, Robert.
Good morning, Bruce.
In the midst of all this going on, why did the United States President Donald Trump visit a church and a Christian shrine while the race protests were still going on?
Well, it's what analysts call a photo opportunity. His press spokesperson said that it was comparable to Winston Churchill visiting the remnants of buildings after they'd been bombed by the Germans in 1941 in the UK. I think that's stretching it. I think it was an act of political symbolism. After all, Mr. Trump probably broke the First Amendment to have that photo opportunity or contravened the First Amendment because peaceful protesters were tear gassed and on the receiving end of rubber bullets in order to clear the space so he could walk over to St. John's Church and get that photograph of him clutching a Bible. Many church officials, some directly and some not directly connected to the church itself, were very, very critical. One described it as outrageous.
He apparently, even according to research polls this week, he still has a strong support base amongst white churchgoers. But do you think that those white churchgoers are going to be more swayed by his photo op or by church leaders who have been critical of him?
It's a difficult one to assess. I think had Mr. Trump been a devout churchgoer, then his gesture may have carried more weight. But I think even people sympathetic to Trump acknowledge that he's not particularly devout. And according to some commentators, it was the first time he went near a church since January. So I think that's a difficult one to assess. I think he's probably lost more than he's gained because it seemed very cynical. And unfortunately, it is symptomatic, Bruce, of a president who's had real problems getting to grips with the moral issues raised by this appalling murder of an African American, George Floyd, a sort of slow motion murder captured, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, on video. And, it took him a week before he made a nationwide address. And this gesture, a photo op, again shows that political calculations are very high in Mr. Trump's calculations. Rather than diffusing the immediate problem, he seems to be thinking ahead to November, the election, what looks good and what can support his base and keep it happy.
The Black Lives Solidarity protests in New Zealand were heavily dominated by young people. Why was that?
Well, I think many young people, they live in a borderless world. They've been born into an era where the internet is there at their disposal. They don't see the world in such compartmentalized terms as older generations. And I think they identify strongly and are probably very frustrated that, in a sense, as many young people have pointed out, George Floyd's tragic death is not a one-off. It's just one of a succession of incidents in which unarmed African Americans have died in police custody in very unfortunate circumstances. So I think that combination of seeing the world differently, perhaps also many young people, I have the great privilege of teaching many young people, they feel tremendous passion about injustice. And you couldn't get, a more graphic injustice than a police officer maintaining a knee on somebody's neck to the point, even 3 minutes after they lost consciousness, that knee was still being applied. So I think many young people are completely outraged by this. I think they see the world differently. They think human beings, irrespective of their country and irrespective of their race, irrespective of their gender, are entitled to certain basic protections and rights. And I think that may be one of the reasons why many young people feel strongly about it in this country and elsewhere. There's one other point to add here, is that I think people in this country, not just young people, are outraged, particularly after the Christchurch terror atrocity, where we were sensitized to the fact that people who believe in white supremacy and white nationalism, this is not just a problem confined to the United States. It has also been evident in this country. And I think that may be another reason why there have been strong demonstrations in many New Zealand cities, including our own in Dunedin, of solidarity with the protesters in the United States.
I take your point. At the same time, it's not as though we haven't had cases of racism here in New Zealand, and those haven't brought young people out onto the streets. What role do you think globalization and young people being immersed in US media is playing in this, if anything?
Well, firstly, with respect, Bruce, I don't think we've had a case. We've certainly had cases of racism, and I think, we shouldn't be complacent. We've still got progress and some way to go in improving race relations in this country. Although compared with the United States, I think our record is, pretty positive on the whole. And I think if we had a comparable incident to what we've just witnessed in the United States, I would expect a strong reaction here. It's sometimes, I think it's just the nature of the incident, the way it was captured on video may have played a part in the very strong reaction here. But your question is a good one. We still have problems, and we certainly have people who hold views which are sympathetic to white nationalism here. So there's no room for complacency. I just think we've made more progress in addressing the problem than perhaps the United States has.
Thank you. I'd like to read a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. So 50 years ago, and he said, "Let me say, as I have always said, and I will always continue to say, that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard." End quote. Can I ask you, how do we get justice and social cohesion? How do we do that without killing free speech and forcing people to conform, but also without ignoring the reality and pretending that everything's always okay?
Well, I think that the last point you made is very, very important. There's no magic formula for achieving justice and equality, but you do have to try to achieve it. That is, you do have to recognize there is a problem. And what the problem, or one of the issues that's really enraged people in the United States, is first of all, the president was incredibly slow to make a nationwide address. Instead, he spent the first week on Twitter making quite belligerent noises in which he has lumped together protesters with looters and people committing damage to property. Now, there's no doubt about it. There will be people from the left and the right trying to exploit this opportunity created by the protests. But that shouldn't detract from the fundamental cause. We shouldn't get deflected by the symptoms. The cause of this crisis is the unlawful killing of a person in police custody, George Floyd, who was unarmed. So that's why people have been outraged. And I think one way of trying to, if you want to try to achieve justice and equality, I think one prerequisite for a political leader is to show empathy and compassion. I would have expected that most of us who've had children and then witness something like that and know what it's like to lose people close to us, would have expected the president to make a nationwide televised address to trying to rally the country and unite it, just like John F. Kennedy did when there were race problems in Alabama in 1963. I think you'd expect the president to reach out and say that he feels the pain of the people concerned. But it's not just a question of what I call feel-good tactics, reaching out and showing that you're empathetic. I think the protest could have been avoided had President Trump done that at the outset. But I think the other thing is you have to show that you're prepared to take firm action to avoid a repetition of this. So far, there has been little sign that the president's prepared to do that. For example, many Americans are demanding independent investigations by the Department of Justice to ensure that anyone who's died in such circumstances, they are subject to an independent investigation. That might convince many people that the police were acting on the side of innocent people all the time. And, so I think those two steps of expressing compassion, reaching out to a community, let's face it, who have been on the receiving end of successive acts of police violence. It shouldn't be forgotten that Black Lives was created after the death of a 13-year-old African-American, Trayvon Martin, in 2012. And the person who was responsible for that man's death, or that young boy's death, is now free to tell his story, Mr. Zimmerman. So I think it's a combination, those qualities in many respects that Jacinda Ardern showed immediately after the Christchurch terror atrocity, of combining compassion and empathy with a willingness to take decisive action to squarely address a major problem that's occurring in American heavy-handed policing of the African American community. And one thing you don't do is what Mr. Trump has done, which is essentially play politics with an issue of enormous sensitivity to many people, which I think has added fuel to the flames. And I think the other thing is, why has Mr. Trump not taken the sort of steps we, you and I have just discussed? Possibly because he's played a part in creating an environment where such an incident like this has occurred. After all, it was Mr. Trump who said the police at a police conference, I think in 2017 or even 2018, when he made a keynote address at a police conference, he encouraged them not to be nice when they arrested criminals. And he has taken steps which have, as one police official said, the president had taken the handcuffs off the police when dealing with people suspected of criminal activities. So if anything, President Trump has done nothing to discourage ill discipline and heavy-handed tactics by the police. He has also made well-documented slights about minorities, both in the United States and those wishing to join the United States or enter the United States from abroad. Again, his rhetoric has created a climate which has made such a situation possible. Now, we've got to be fair. The United States has been blighted by this problem of racism long before Mr. Trump came to the presidency. But I think some of his tactics since he's been in office, and certainly during this crisis, have not brought about the reconciliation that his office does actually have the power to implement. So that to me is a major disappointment.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Te pono me te aroha.